This first session after lunch, we're going to look at challenge 3, which is around what social and spatial inequalities exacerbate gambling harms. And this is really thinking about the spaces in which harm can occur, communities who might be at particular risk of harm. And like session 2, I think it gives us a really good sense of lived experience of gambling and gambling harms and how we should be paying attention to that in terms of thinking about ways to address gambling harms. So our keynote for session 3 today is from Rob Davis. It's a pre-recorded keynote. Unfortunately, Rob couldn't be with us. As many of you will know, and I'm sure many of you might have read Rob's book, he's an investigative reporter for The Guardian, and he has looked in great depth at the gambling industry in the UK. So I won't say too much because Rob's going to tell us a bit more about his work in his session. Rob also would just like to wanted to share some footnotes that he's got that he refers to throughout his presentation. And you can access those footnotes via the QR code on page 5 of the conference programme. So if you want to have a look either during Rob's presentation or afterwards, he does flag when they're relevant in his presentation. So they're all there for you to look at, and you can go and look at the sources that he's talking about, some of which are research reports and some of which are his own articles. So without further ado, we'll hear from Rob, and then we will have a panel session with, again, some amazing speakers to discuss some of the issues about this particular challenge.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rob Davis. I'm a journalist with The Guardian. I started reporting on gambling in 2015 without much enthusiasm for the job, I have to admit. It was kind of an accident. I'd missed out on another job, and this was the consolation prize, according to my boss. I thought it was going to be quite a boring sector to write about. In the end, I could not have been more wrong. It feels as if the past 7 or 8 years has just been a tsunami of stories, sometimes too many to handle all at the same time, often shocking, often horrifying. Right from the outset, it was clear that not only was this a diverse and very interesting industry, but that it could have profoundly negative effects on people. It wasn't unusual in that respect. We're all aware of the damage that oil and gas, for instance, does to the planet, or the harm caused by alcohol addiction. The difference here was that I just didn't know about it before, and neither did most people that I'd seemed to talk to. There was this world of addiction, financial ruin, crime, family breakups out there linked to the most harmful gambling products that was really flying under the radar unless it was something that you had personal experience of. I've been asked to talk about the social spatial factors that exacerbate gambling harm. I'll admit that kind of brief is a little outside my usual area of competence. I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher, I don't write long theses or conduct experiments in search of a conclusion. My job, as I see it, is to find things out that companies don't want people to know and then tell as many people as I possibly can. However, in the course of my work, I've come across lots of examples where social and spatial factors were pivotal in the reporting and the telling of a story. For that reason, I'm going to talk mostly from anecdotal experience, albeit experience gained over 7-8 years of reporting on gambling, including the research and the writing of my book, Jackpot: How Gambling Conquered Britain. I want to start by talking about a couple of real-world examples from my reporting. There's a gambling campaigner and former addict called Martin Patterson, who comes from an economically disadvantaged area called Coatbridge, just outside Glasgow. Now, as of a couple of years ago, when I was researching my book, Coatbridge had 22 betting shops serving a population of 42,000. That's about 1 for every 2,000 people. Nearby Milngavie is about a third of the size, so 15-odd thousand people. It has just 1 betting shop. Milngavie is, of course, much more prosperous than Coatbridge. The second real-world example is from a trip I took to Newham in East London in 2017. You can find the piece I wrote at footnote 1. Newham is a really good example of clustering. That's the phenomenon that many of you will know about, where bookies put as many shops as they can in one place to circumvent the laws limiting the number of fixed odds betting terminals, or FOBTs as they're better known, to 4 per shop. That's a legacy of really bad planning laws, which I haven't the time nor probably the expertise to go into here. Anyway, I hadn't spent much time in bookies before that, but I've been writing a lot about FOBTs, and I wanted to experience them firsthand, so that when I wrote, I knew a little bit about what I was talking. So I took £50 of the Guardian's money, and I went into every bookie on Newham High Street playing the machines, spent all afternoon there. Obviously, this is not a controlled experiment in any way, but it did bring home to me something that I'd only previously heard about. Of the half dozen bookies that I went into, the machines were full in every one. Every machine was occupied. Sometimes one person would be playing 2 machines at the same time. And on most occasions, somebody was in distress. They were cursing or slamming their hand down on the screen, pacing up and down and muttering to themselves when they lost a bet. And I followed this one guy who'd spent all his money, and I watched him walk up the high street, slamming his fist into walls as he went. Like Coatbridge, Newham is one of the more impoverished areas of Britain. You don't find that on the high street of Kensington. And these are anecdotes, but they're backed up by the research. In fact, by University of Bristol research from 2021, which I wrote about in The Guardian at the time. Please see footnotes 2 and 3 for that. The report found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that gambling premises were 10 times more prevalent in the poorest areas than in the most affluent ones. Now, there are some environmental factors behind that. Bookies tend to be on town centre high streets. That's where the footfall is. And affluent people, by and large, don't live above city centre shops. However, gambling harm skews towards the poorest in society, even when you strip out those factors. In 2022, a report by the University of Liverpool and NatSen, which you can find as footnote 4, found that online gambling losses were concentrated in the most deprived areas, even when you just look at online play. Check out footnote 5, I think, for the article I wrote about that at the time. Now, that's not to say that gambling harm is a poor person's problem. I've sat with many families affected by it, and they range across a broad spectrum of economic backgrounds. But what reports like this suggest, to me anyway, is that the greatest amount of harm is happening among those with the least tools to be able to withstand it, the poorest, the most vulnerable, and often the desperate. Geography and economics are extremely important factors when considering harm. I think it's also important to consider other factors. Let's not forget aspects such as gender and potentially even race and culture. Typically, gambling-related harm is more prominent among men, particularly young men. I'm only speculating, but it seems possible that there's a link there to a culture of higher risk appetite among men. We've seen this, studies have shown this in hypotheses about the reasons behind the 2008 banking crisis, for instance. And we've seen in recent years, the number of women with a gambling problem has crept up. Check out footnote 6. And something that has happened alongside that is that gambling operators have been much more adept at targeting women customers. You might speculate there's an element of causation there. Earlier this year, I wrote about one particularly underhand way that the bookmaker Coral had of doing that, of enticing more female gamblers. You can find this at footnote 7. What they were doing was paying blogs aimed at new mothers to carry disguised adverts pushing online casino games. In a saturated market, where a high percentage of men already gamble in some way, this was an obvious way of bringing in new customers to drive growth, targeting women and bringing them in to join the activity. For whatever reason, the data shows that women are less likely to be interested in sports betting, much more attracted to online bingo and casino games. Those are some of the products where the highest rates of problem gambling are to be found, according to the NHS Health Survey of 2018, which is the last one that broke down in any meaningful way instances of problem gambling in relation to products. I'm sure you're all familiar with that survey, but I've linked to it in footnote 8. And this is an emerging trend, one we're yet to see the full results of. We shouldn't forget other factors either. The same survey, the 2018 survey, found a problem gambling rate of 0.5% in the general population, but nearly 2% among the unemployed. There were discrepancies based on race as well, although I'd want to see much more detailed research before I came to any conclusions about that. There's been some great work on these social, cultural, and spatial factors done within academia. I often rely on reports, including by Bristol, to generate news stories. However, what I don't want us to lose sight of is that nobody knows more about these matters than the industry itself. We know they gather our data. We know they use algorithms to determine how to market potentially addictive products. We know, of course, that they single out customers as potential VIPs based on how much they're likely to lose. Some years ago, acting on a tip from a source at the Gambling Commission, I obtained an internal document showing that some companies derived nearly all of their revenue from just a tiny fraction of their clientele, the so-called VIPs. I enclosed that presentation in an email to the organisers of this event. That should be footnote 9 or potentially attached to material that you've been given. The social and spatial factors we're talking about today aren't just important when analysing harm. They're at the root of how the industry is constantly evolving and fine-tuning its ability to siphon cash out of our wallets. These factors aren't the symptoms of a problem. They are the weakness in our immune systems that allows the infection to take hold. To varying degrees, the industry knows this full well. Any analysis of harm should take that idea as its terrifying starting point. There's a lot more that I could say. I'm conscious that I'm nudging up against my time limit here. So if there's a message I want to leave you with, it's that we're only in the early years of a culture, within this country at least, where gambling is totally inescapable. The Gambling Act, the one that gave us the regulatory landscape we know today, came into effect in 2007. The mass proliferation of gambling products and gambling marketing was in the years that followed that. What that means is that the first generation of kids who grew up steeped in that culture are only really turning 18 now. They're only really becoming of age to gamble now. That's why it's so important to keep working, to keep researching gambling harm, to keep highlighting bad practice where we find it, and putting pressure on politicians and the industry to do right by some of the most vulnerable people in society. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoy the rest of the event.
Oh, thanks very much to Rob for taking the time to record that for us. I'm going to invite up our panel members for this session. I'm delighted to invite up Joe Large, a colleague from the University of Bristol, Karwei Lee from the National University of Singapore, and Rhys Bush-Evans from Bournemouth University. Thanks very much, guys. So we're going to, Rob's given us a really good overview, I think, of some of the issues here from his own investigative journalism, and also really interesting to hear how he's using research and all of the kind of tools that he's got in his toolbox here to kind of understand what's happening and understand those spatial and social inequalities and how they affect people and cause harm. So we're going to have three speakers this afternoon on the panel who talk about this issue from a number of different perspectives. So first of all, I'm delighted to welcome Joe Large, who's a senior lecturer in criminology here in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. And she's also co-lead for one of the themes with the Bristol Hub for Gambling Harms Research. Joe's research really focuses on where harm is embedded and often normalised in the everyday practices of consumer leisure industries. So it touches, I think it picks up really nicely on some of those themes that we were talking about this morning. She's currently researching the experiences of employees in betting shops in relation to their responsibility for implementing safer gambling practices. And today, Joe's going to talk to us about developing a social harms approach to gambling and thinking about the hidden harms of gambling spaces. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the betting shop project, which Sam Cohen, who was in the panel earlier, I've been working with on this project. So we were interested in joining together our backgrounds on social policy, critical criminology, and our kind of interest in these areas to examine where opportunities for hidden harms might exist within gambling spaces, and particularly thinking about how that might relate to employees within the industry who now have these new responsibilities placed on them. So we're particularly interested in the impact of regulations and policy implemented to reduce gambling harms and how they play out in these spaces. So it was a small-scale exploratory piece of research which was funded by the Bristol Gambling Harms Hub to examine the experience of employees of betting shops specifically and their day-to-day role and responsibilities in relation to actioning social responsibility codes of responsible gambling and that kind of regulatory framework around that. So the project obviously had lots of important issues and findings, and we've got a very short amount of time, so I'm going to kind of talk us about the emerging themes and findings which kind of came from that. So we found this really clear sense of there were new problems which are characterised by the change in physical, technological and cultural space of the betting shop. Recognising that the space has undergone quite considerable transformation over the past few decades, shaped by legislative changes, technological changes, market changes as well. And much of the discussion which is currently shaping debates around gambling and gambling harms is shaped by technology, and particularly the role of online gambling, which has been highlighted earlier. The focus of the white paper, very much on online gambling, and recognises one of those dominant technological changes in this area. But we come from a position that when you live in a techno-social digital society, actually thinking about online and offline as two distinct things is not really that helpful. And in the context of our research, so Jamie Wheaton, who's speaking a bit later, talks about the pressures on cashiers to sign customers up for online accounts, for example. Some of our employees talked about using their phones to gamble whilst they were bored in kind of downtimes within the shop. Our research, as existing research did, and as Rob talked about, the introduction of the fixed or betting terminals was really, really key as well. One of the most significant changes in betting shops. And it was the single biggest issue which shaped the experience of our participants in our study. Stories of frustration and violence were really common. And physically, the machines created further distance between staff and customers, producing difficulties in the requirement to interact in the ways expected by the Gambling Commission in terms of reducing harms associated with gambling. So the impact of the machines just came up over and over again during the interviews. There was this really general and clear consensus that the machines offered nothing good, except to the profits of the industry. And we heard from employees with really long and really passionate associations with working for betting shops, how machines had changed these spaces beyond recognition. They gave us a sense that they brought in a new type of customer and that they were predicated on being highly addictive and antisocial. And so fundamentally, the conflicting ideologies and generating the biggest profits whilst preventing the biggest spenders from gambling was at the heart of the problem which kind of our employees were getting towards. Really kind of identifying the problem with industry-led regulation in this sense, and the problems with having these machines within the shops. So for all of the emphasis about premises-based interaction, the need to encourage people to break from spending money, it was clear that certainly in the mind of employees, they felt that machines worked in opposition to this. And the backdrop of aggression and violence that many employees associate with the machine use is clear. And for many, it made the attempts to intervene very stressful and really, really challenging. Gender, age, and physique further impacted on an employee's perceived ability around intervening in the shops as well. The social responsibility codes also focus on affordability, and under the regulatory guidance, employees have this duty bound to ensure somebody's gambling within their means, which created a sense of anxiety and stress for many as well, feeling like they kind of were in a very difficult position in terms of interacting with people about their spending. As emphasised by the white paper, this is something which is increasingly monitored by customer surveillance, monitoring of accounts and spending, prompts to then interact. And we thought that this use of data monitoring and surveillance is something which actually needs more exploration, because it really contributed towards the forms of stress and anxiety which were felt by employees. And this then related to a common theme that many staff are fearful of losing their jobs if they were caught not following up on trigger checks and intervening with risky behaviour. And in some cases, participants told us about being disciplined and fired for missing an exclusion or for not completing required checks. The common use of single manning and lone working further impacted on the perception of employees' abilities to conduct interactions. Self-exclusion, again, is something which has been central to the regulatory approach, relying on individuals to identify and kind of police their own gambling. But there's been little recognition about the effect of this places on employees. They found it particularly often was stressful and uncertainty. And again, issues around kind of particularly with numbers of shops in a particular area. And this has kind of been addressed with particular changes, such as Moses scheme. But again, employees found this very difficult to implement in practice, and talked about, huge folders with huge numbers of poor quality pictures in, and the difficulties in terms of recognising that. So ultimately, we have this situation where the work environment is low pay, long hours, often difficult working conditions, threats of violence and aggression, accompanied by anxiety and fear around enforcing and engaging with safer gambling regulations. And this wasn't at all to say that employees didn't take their responsibilities seriously or consider that it was important, but they did kind of often find it a problematic part of their role. Many of the employees took a really immense pride in creating a safe environment, but they felt that the ways in which operators created the sense of responsibility to staff was quite problematic. And the ways in which operators, at the same time of being critical of the interaction mandated by the code, they also often express senses of care towards customers as well, which quite often sat in conflict with notions that they felt, I'm not a social worker, I'm not qualified to deal with these really, really problematic kind of things which underpin gambling habits. So very much kind of a conflict around the customer interaction directed of them, but also with the machines. So just in very brief conclusion, we suggest our research should carefully consider the impact of placing the onus on safer gambling responsibilities on employees. Operators might bear the financial burdens in terms of fines being issued, but it's the employee who bears the day-to-day burden of regulatory and emotional labour associated with this. So we think that in examining a work-based harms perspective or social harms perspective allows us to identify hidden harms of low-paid, long hours and difficult situations where violence and aggression is normal. I'm going to wrap.
Thanks so much, Jo. Thanks, Jo. I think that's really, really interesting, because I think the employee, like the frontline employee perspective, is one we've picked up a little bit in some work that we've done on women and gambling, but it's a very underheard voice, I think. So really fantastic to hear the emerging findings from that. Our second speaker on the panel today, I'm delighted, and wins the prize for the person who's travelled the furthest. So thank you very much, Kawei Lee, for making the effort to come and visit the UK. So Kawei is assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. And he is an interdisciplinary academic who studies the politics of casino development in Asian cities. He's authored several books, and in 2021, he was a fellow of the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, during which he published The Myth of the Integrated Resort, Selective History, Retrospective Branding and Fungible Assets in the journal Critical Gambling Studies. So he brings some fantastic experience and knowledge in terms of urban development, state regulation around the casino-based industry. And Kawei is going to talk to us about advertising by other means, regulating accessibility and visibility in Singapore. And I know, Kawei, you've got some slides, so do you want to, just move them on to the first one.
Definitely. Thanks, Sharon and Agnes and everybody at the Hub for having me here. As an interdisciplinary scholar, I tend to find myself being the odd one out in a panel. And so my job today is to bring everybody across to my discipline and see some of these connections between urban development and gaming policy. So as my title suggests, I'd like us to find these productive and interesting connections and ask how buildings and physical infrastructure can be seen as advertising by other means. So I'm going to use the case of Singapore to flesh out some of these connections. Since we are short on time, I'm not going to give the context. I'm just going to jump straight into it. Singapore has always had a kind of a very strong anti-casino posture. But in 2007, 2010, it decided to end that casino ban and gave out 2 licenses for large casino developments, which it calls integrated resorts. In 2010, when both casino properties finally opened for business, the operators immediately rolled out an extensive network of free shuttle buses to bring in customers from various parts of the island. Now, the buses fanned out to ports of entry like airports and harbors, but also the various parts of the island where locals worked and resided. So let me quote the parliamentary debates where this issue was raised. I quote, Marina Bay Sands, which is the name of the first integrated resort, was offering a paid premium service at 12 pickup points. It charged premium fares, but these were redeemable at food and beverage outlets, some of which were in the casino. Resorts World at Sentosa, which is the other integrated resort, provided free shuttle bus services at 19 pickup points. Most of them were in the heartlands and the central business districts. They were clearly not part of the public transport network. These buses also operated very long hours. These late hours meant that most of the facilities at RWS were closed, except for the casino, end quote. They were clearly not part of the public transport network. I want to emphasize this sentence because it foreshadowed the government's response. On the one hand, the government immediately shut down these free shuttle bus services. And on the other hand, it extended the routes of specific public bus services to include a stop at these two casino properties. So the map here, in other words, the free shuttle bus routes were assimilated into the existing public transport system. So the map here shows the public bus routes that currently serve the two casino properties, which you'll see named Marina Bay Sands and Resorts World Sentosa. So there are 2 points I want to make here. The first point is that this is not really about, or this is not simply about reducing the accessibility of the two properties. After all, there's nothing stopping people taking basically a cab or the train to these two properties, and Singapore's public transport is pretty efficient. But rather, it is more about denying the industry a private and separate infrastructure that is able to make targeted connections between the casino and its customers, bypassing the everyday rhythms of work and leisure. It is also about denying the visibility of the industry outside of its physical location. So very often these free shuttle buses are emblazoned with the company's insignias and slogans, brightly colored. They are effectively mobile advertisements. The second point I want to make is that these are not just buses that bring people to the casino, but rather these buses are an extension of the casino to the doorsteps of the customers. Once we take into account the kinds of transactions that begin the moment you board the buses, right? So from the cost of transport that is interchangeable and redeemable as free chips, or they can be exchanged for food or loyalty points and so on and so forth. And also the experience of luxury and comfort that is associated with the casino. So it's about, I like to think of it as extruding the doors of the casino to the customer. And it begins at the point of boarding the bus rather than alighting the bus. And I want to quickly juxtapose very quickly the case of Macau. And the case of Macau is often seen as a success story. Okay, so this is what I tried to do. I've mapped out the buses around Macau. In Macau, there are 6 foreign casino concessions. They all maintain and operated their own fleets of free shuttle buses. 2010, there was a survey done which showed that there were 3,522 free shuttle buses left these properties for the various ports of entry. It concluded that the buses will cover a total distance of 15 million kilometers per hour per year. Just to put this into perspective, the total length of roads in Macau is 200 kilometers. And the distance between Earth and the Moon is 400,000 kilometers. But we're talking about 15 million kilometers of distance traveled every year by these free shuttle buses. So the point I suppose I want to make is that what we are seeing in Macau is the end point of a much larger extraterritorial network that reaches out into the urban centers of China. right? So the reason why Macau is so profitable is precisely because it's drawing these markets into Macau, and what the density of the free shuttle buses is basically the endpoint of this flow of customers. And from the perspective of Singapore, I was trying to do the same with Singapore as well. And so I traveled to Malaysia on some of these buses. Even though the free shuttle buses were clamped down, but I realized that they're actually private bus contractors that continue to ply the routes between Singapore and Malaysia. And so I met out two of them, and it became very apparent that this is a kind of a one-way mirror. This is an invisible network that is only visible if you stand outside the territory of the host city. And the question that this immediately raises, I think, is quite a familiar one. So are hosting cities exporting harm beyond their territories? Okay, so I think my time's up, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
So much. I think that's really interesting because it continues some of the discussion we had in the morning panels around incentives, and it's not just about free bets, or perhaps it's about the insidious nature of how these practices can impinge on everyday life, as you and Joe have both kind of described. So thank you very much for that. Really interesting to hear that international perspective and get that kind of international dimension. So our third speaker on the panel today, I'm really delighted to welcome Rhys Bush-Evans, who's a lecturer in psychology, and he's a member of the Gambling Research Group at Bournemouth University, who are doing great work, a fantastic range of research that the team there are doing. Rhys's research really focuses on the kind of social and psychological aspects of behaviour change. So touching a little bit kind of in common with what we heard from panel one this morning. And he uses mixed methods approaches, and his work recently has focused on, and what he's going to talk to us about today, is investigating the potential risk factors for gambling harms in LGBTQIA+ communities. So thanks very much, Rhys.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me and Bristol Hub for organising this. It's amazing. So yes, I'm going to talk today about my research that I'm currently undertaking, which is looking at LGBTQ+ communities and the risk of gambling harm within these subpopulations. It's an area that I'm very passionate about as a gay man, and also from someone who comes from lived experience as an affected other. And it's also a very underrepresented and under-researched area, which sort of angers me into making want to do a little bit more research. The research was funded by a QR grant at Bournemouth University, which I know how to discuss. So if you're not familiar, the LGBTQ+ community is a diverse group of people and individuals who fall under different multitude of sexual and gender minorities. So sexual minority groups may include gay, lesbian, pansexual, asexual, among others. And gender minority groups include transgender, non-binary, and gender diverse individuals, among others as well. Now, are they prone to a lot of measurement issues? What we've seen is that there's been a notable growth of individuals who have started to identify as LGBTQ+. We're seeing it year upon year. It's getting larger, which is fantastic. But in doing so, we also start to see some of the research which sort of highlights some of the risk factors for this marginalized group. So the risk behaviors and the poor outcomes of health that are associated with this particular population. So for example, evidence suggests that gay or bisexual adults are more likely to have taken an illicit drug in the last 12 months than heterosexual adults, and that youth LGBTQ+ individuals are more likely to have attempted suicide or have suicidal ideations than their heterosexual counterparts. We also see that the LGBT community is at greater risk of poor health-related outcomes, and that this is often associated with stigma attached to having LGBTQ+ identity. So the prejudices, the discrimination, and the harassment that's often faced by the community, and that this can also lead to poor health outcomes such as gambling harm. So for me, it's important to consider LGBTQ+ as a determinant of health. Furthermore, LGBTQ+ communities often face incredible barriers with reaching and accessing support for anything. And those who do experience gambling harm, for me, they may face additional barriers, not only just to the, they may face additional barriers due to the compounding stigma attached with not only problem gambling, but also being part of the LGBTQ+ community. So for me, understanding whether or not sexual orientation and gender identity is a risk factor for problem gambling is a very important thing. It enables us to look at the demographic variations within gambling behavior, but also to answer and look into different cultural, societal, psychological factors that may play a particular role. However, there is limited research in this area. It's emerging, which is fantastic, and I'm very excited to see how it's coming about. But the research that is out there is often quite mixed. So that yields quite mixed results. And some research only focuses on some subpopulations of the LGBT community, so only focusing on gay men rather than the rest of the spectrum. So why is it actually important? Why should we care? Well, you can adopt different theoretical perspectives as to understanding why we think this might be a problem within the community. One that I'd like to stress on is a minority stress framework model. And this suggests that individuals from marginalized populations, such as LGBTQ+ communities, are at greater risk of discrimination and subsequent negative mental health outcomes due to the stigma, just the stigma attached to being part of the community, just the stigma of being attached to the community. And what happens within these communities is that the stresses attached to being part of the marginalized status often leads to engagement with risky behavior, such as drug taking, alcohol use, violence, so on and so forth. So why not also it being a factor for gambling? What did I do? Due to the nature of the research, I wanted to do mixed method study, whereby I collected quantitative and qualitative data. So a survey of 321 people and 20 follow-up semi-structured interviews. UK, 18+, identify as LGBTQ+, and gamble at least once a week. Within the online survey, participants answered questions about their sexual orientation, their gender identity. Obviously, they answered questions about gambling, so their motivations for gambling. Wow, okay. Motivations for gambling, social norms around gambling, their PGSI scores, looked at their quality of life, depression, anxiety, so on and so forth. And within the interviews, we managed to go into a little bit more depth and try to work out the risk factors that they perceive to be within the community. So from the survey, we found that over 2/3 of those who gamble experience some level of harm with scores of 1+ on the PGSI, and over 14% were indicative of problem gambling with 8+ on the PGSI. Significant relationships were found between the distress caused by life stresses as an LGBT individual, so harassment, discrimination, vicarious trauma, isolation, and problem gambling levels. More importantly, we found that the risk associated with these stresses as an LGBT individual linked and predicted high levels of gambling, and the individuals used this as a coping mechanism, so a coping strategy. 71% of the sample identified as having some form of discrimination or harassment experience, being part of the LGBT community. 89% experienced some form of isolation, and over 1/3 were moderate to severely depressed. From the interviews, this is, I think, where I want to sort of hone in the last 2 minutes. We identified some really, really interesting nuances. So for some individuals, for them, gambling was a form of coping and a way to cope with things that were going on in their life, particularly as an LGBT individual. So some people used it as a masking tactic when they went out with their straight counterparts and their straight friends and their colleagues. So they used gambling as a form to hide who they were. Next, many individuals reported that they actually experienced negative outcomes, negative emotions or discomfort actually going to land-based venues. Some people were attacked, and some of this was based upon the perception of the stereotypical image of the individual you might find in a bookies. And then finally, more importantly, individuals who did actually state that they experienced some gambling harm felt that the generic gambling support services that are currently available don't cater to the needs of an LGBTQ+ individual. That is, as a gay man, I may not want to speak to someone who I believe may be a cisgendered heterosexual individual about how I might be addicted to gambling and how that might be linked to my sexuality due to some preconceived biases. And finally, people stated that more tailored support, particularly for marginalized communities and marginalized communities that actually face a lot of barriers to access and support, is the most important step forward. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. 7 minutes doesn't go very far, does it? So thanks everyone for those really, really interesting presentations, and again, thanks to Rob for setting us up so nicely for the discussion. So we've got a bit of time. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. So I will be more vigilant on Slido. I'll take a couple from Slido and then open it up to the floor. So we've got a question from Rosalind Baker-Frampton for Carway. Are the casinos in Singapore aimed at rich tourists or locals?
Okay.
Rosalind would like to know.
Yeah, I mean, that really gets to the crux of the issue, which is that we do not know the exact distribution, but we do know that the profits that the casinos in Singapore make is only possible because it's able to attract very rich foreign VIP gamblers, a lot of them from China, right? So, of course, I believe Singapore being quite a wealthy city-state, lots of locals will gamble, but the kind of revenue that we're seeing is only possible is able to tap basically the VIP gamblers from China and maybe Korea and Japan as well. So what we're looking at in Singapore as well as Macau and Manila, the 3 new gaming jurisdictions, is basically a form of what we call extraterritorial taxation, right? It's about taxing people outside of your borders. Yeah.
And if I might just have a kind of follow-up question to that, Carway, with your mapping, so where the kind of shuttle buses were stopping or had been stopping, were they kind of linked to big tourist hotels or places where people might be staying who were visiting from China?
So the free shuttle buses, yes, they were connecting touristy areas like Orchard Road is a tourist strip to the casino properties. But they're also connecting central business districts, which is basically workers. I mean, at the day of after you finish work at 5 p.m. you could go straight to the casinos, and some of the buses will go directly to the residential estates where locals, middle class Singaporeans will live. So, so I think at least from the perspective of the government, they are, of course, like I said, it's about, we are fine if you target the tourists and the foreigners, but we are going to come down hard or if you're targeting the local citizens.
Thank you. Any questions in the room for any of our panelists? We've got a couple there, so I'll just take gentleman there. Is that Matt?
Yeah, hi, Matt from ARA. I'm in recovery myself from Gambling Harms. This question is for Carway as well. I was in the armed forces for several years, and I was actually based in Singapore for some time in Sambuang. And what you've just mentioned has really hit home to me and made me reflect on my own experience, because I was out there in 2010 and 2011, and I was subjective to what you've just spoken about. We been in the British Armed Forces. We were treated very well out there, and I have attended a certain shuttle bus to Marina Bay Sands, and I was treated along with my peers as almost with celebrity status. And looking back now, it's something I've not spoken about or thought about, but it's actually been probably a contributing factor to where I ended up. And for those that aren't aware in the room, I've seen recently actually some advertising that's been carried out in Singapore on the television, some really powerful, very short adverts. Are those still present? And my first question was, were they devised as a byproduct of the casinos being established in Singapore? And are they still as hard-hitting and relevant on the televisions out there at the moment?
Are we talking about advertisements that warn about the potential harms of gambling?
Yeah, one that springs to mind is a gentleman who's asking one more time, and there's a little girl with a piggy bank.
Yes, so these advertisements are still shown. So, the narrative generally is about, gambling and then borrowing money and then broken family, etc., and then domestic violence. So there is definitely that kind of a targeted kind of, on the one hand, opening up casinos, but on the other hand, sending the message out to the local citizens that, you should be careful about gambling. But it's not just about the gambling advertisement. I think if we pay attention to the advertisements that are emerging, we start to see the ecology of activities and businesses. So we see these kinds of advertisements that warn about the dangers of gambling. We also see advertisements that warn about the dangers of money lending, because we're starting to see a lot of private money lenders. And we're starting to see debates about the emergence of a lot of pawn shops. So there's entire ecology that brings, you can sort of see the connections if you pay attention to, what's happening on the TVs.
Thank you very much, Carl. We've got a question here. And I'm going to take another.
Thanks very much. I'd like to flag a couple of areas where I think harm can be exacerbated. The first is in certain professions and frontline services, typically where they've got quite a high stress level, they're going to find it difficult to reach out for help. I'm thinking particularly of chartered accountants, where probably once every 3 months they have to sign up to say, I'm still a fit and proper person. And the other is members of the police force, where probably their terms and conditions suggest that compulsive gambling is serious misconduct and subject to summary dismissal. So those, and I'm sure there are others, have got a large pressure to suppress their gambling harms. And the other is university first years, where young people arrive with some freedom and some money, perhaps for the first time, and can easily lose their first term's money within the first week. And I wonder how many universities are actually looking out for that and tracking how many people are in that category. So I'd like to ask the panel whether they recognise those. And finally, an apology. I spoke in the earlier question I raised about 7% of front of shirts advertising. I forgot to attribute that. That was University of Chester, I believe, and Dr. Phil Newell, who's probably around here. Sorry, Phil.
Thanks very much for the question. So I think that's open to the panel. I think if I'm right in understanding, you kind of recognising that some professionals it's quite difficult to disclose those issues because of the professional codes and things that they sign up to, and also a question about universities and I guess other educational institutions recognising the risk of gambling amongst their students, and particularly first years. So I don't know, Reese, would you like to take that on any?
Oh gosh, I don't really have experience in the first part of that question, so I won't offer any opinions there. I think in regards to the university, you're right, there is like a lot of research which suggests that it is quite problematic for some students, and many use their university grants quite soon after receiving them, and then they sort of struggle thereafter. I've seen that in some universities that they are implementing different sort of social norms messaging to sort of, I guess, dissuade people from those behaviours. Whether or not they're effective, I'm not too sure. But yeah, I feel that's the best I can add to that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was just wondering if there was if you knew of anything at Bournemouth, but I think similarly, I think there are discussions going on at Bristol, and anybody from Bristol wants to, either from the university or from partners we're involved with, correct me on that, please do. But I think they're certainly on the radar, but I'm not sure how much is being done. You know that there is, it's slightly different, but one of the lived experience charities that we know of has been working with medical students to make them aware of gambling harms when they go and go out and become GPs, for example. So, but that's not quite the same thing as you're talking about. But yeah, so we might, if anybody's got further thoughts about universities, please do come in.
But sorry, I was going to say, but definitely like freshers fairs and career recruitment fairs and stuff like that, where charities like YGAM, Gordon Moody,
Yeah.
they can come in, which I think would be quite useful if they're not already doing so, which they may be doing so. I know that they work within the sector itself. So yes, I think that would be a good way forward.
Yeah, thanks, Reece. And sorry for putting you somewhat on the spot there. Sharon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it's just an observation really as a current postgraduate student. When I got all the fresh affair information from Bristol, one of the activities being promoted was Bingo Lingo. So I thought that was quite interesting because that was obviously would have gone to all the undergraduate and postgraduate students, and I didn't actually go, but I don't know exactly what was put on, but that was part of the kind of sort of timetabled activities.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Yeah. And just coming back to the point about, did anybody want to make any comments about people in certain professions? I mean, I know from work, I mean, certainly qualitative interviewing we've been doing with people who've experienced gambling harms, I think, and actually people in debt more generally, that when it's not gambling related, for example, has come up as an issue. So I've interviewed people in the armed forces, for example, who weren't able to talk about their debt to their superiors because that absolutely would have been a disciplinary matter. So I think there are those really important boundaries. That was some time ago, so hopefully things have moved on a bit. But I think I guess it's kind of getting the balance right between the codes of conduct that exist and recognising that employers need to be supporting employees in all manner of experiences that they might have. And certainly I think for financial services staff who, for example, had issues with gambling, that would be quite problematic for them to talk about it. So I think that's a really good point to raise. Thank you. And about how that happens. Sorry, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, no, just briefly, not in the public domain, but I've seen a couple of surveys, one for accountants and one for police, both of which suggest the prevalence of problem gambling is probably in the order of 1 to 2% compared to the national prevalence allegedly of 0.3. And I think many employers can look at their own HR terms and conditions and ought to be looking at gambling along the lines of support back to recovery rather than gross misconduct. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think really chimes very well in terms of the hidden spaces themes of today. So yeah, thank you. Of this session. I think we've got time for one more question. There's a question that's coming on Slido for Joe from somebody who asks, could you give some recommendations for dealing with aggressive player behaviour towards the support team? Some players contact support and communicate abusively. So do you think there's any kind of emerging thoughts from your research about how that can be managed?
I mean, I think it's a really difficult one because a lot of what came down to, I think Sam probably reinforced as well, was the issues, particularly when people were lone working in shops. Yeah. So I guess that's an issue there for starters, in the sense of actually how the shop is managed, how it's run. And then of course the use of machines in shops as well, in the sense of the kind of I think Rob's presentation picked up on this as well, in terms of the kind of the encouragement of aggression and the addictive nature of it. So I mean, so this is not to say, actually one thing worth making is some people felt very confident at making interventions. This is not not everybody find it difficult, but really thinking seriously about the nature of the shop, the physical nature of the shop, and how shops are run, and making sure that individuals don't have too much responsibility for dealing with issues which are far beyond actually what they're enabled to. And I think I wouldn't feel confident making full recommendations at this stage, given we're fairly early stages and it was fairly kind of exploratory study. But if we're going to be talking about gambling related harms, we should be thinking about employees within this and thinking from a kind of a broader approach to social harms within.
Do you think you will be looking to make?
Yeah, we're keen to kind of think about this and develop it and speak to various people about this. So
well, hopefully there might be some people in the room who would be interested to have those conversations. But Rebecca's holding up a time up. And, so just to say, let us give a massive round of applause to our panel and to Rob